when she was diagnosed with lung cancer, just her sense of humor, I remember being so upset because she was like, well, that was another house for us, another home. And I said to her, man, I can't believe that you have lung cancer. And she looked at me, she said, really? I've smoked for 40 years. And that was just a sense of humor she carried throughout the entire battle. She didn't, it didn't faze her in the slightest. Like, I'm sure when no one was around, she had her moments, but she was she was probably the strongest woman I think I've ever known.
We actually call her grandmother Ying, which is the Chinese word for grandmother on the father's side of the family.
I called him Grandpa Foot.
We, in our native language, in Hindi, we call them Dada and Dadi.
My other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother.
Chechu means old woman in Kinyarwanda.
I called her Safta, which is a Hebrew word for grandma.
Everybody called her Mamitita.
We called her Mima and Dede.
Grandma.
Hi, I'm Steph.
And I'm Robin. Welcome to Stories from Grandparents,
the podcast where we share stories about and from grandparents.
I really feel like our whole podcast could be about resilience.
Yes, I totally agree.
We have so many stories about how that generation was just like unbelievably tough and like adaptable and just did it and got on with it.
And they had a lot of grit.
They had a lot of grit.
And so on today's episode, we've compiled some of our favorite stories of resilience.
Our first story comes from Arya, whose family immigrated to escape religious persecution.
My name is Arya Cyrus Safar. I had two grandmothers who I grew up with a lot, and my maternal grandmother, Farzana, she would be grandma because she spoke some English, and then my other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother. So I want to talk about my maternal grandmother. My grandmother was Farzana Asbaghi, and she was born in Ashgabat in the former Soviet Union, what is now Turkmenistan, and she used to live in Hamilton, Ontario. She was the undoubted matriarch of our family. She was an extremely strong and resilient person. She had, fled from two countries in her lifetime, was exiled twice. And throughout all of that, she really never sought pity. She never kind of felt bad for herself. She just kept pushing. She was always somebody who was encouraging and was somebody that when people went through difficulty, they would turn to her and she would kind of, help them pull themselves up. I think she just was an incredibly strong person. I think that she was really a role model of resilience just because of what she had gone through. I always think about like what I have gone through, which is not much at all. I gotta say, I'm very lucky. And even my mom, who had to leave Iran, has, gone through a lot, but she, and I guess this is part where I can kind of start telling her story. So she was born in the Soviet Union in 1925, and her mother died at the age of 6 when she was 6 years old. And she's the second of 3 daughters. And her father was left taking care of her, as well as her maternal grandmother, so the woman who just lost her daughter. And then when my grandmother was 9, her father was put in prison because my family comes from a religious minority, we're Baha'i. So she, at this point, was with her maternal grandmother, who was not the most sophisticated person. She grew up in very different circumstances. And she ended up having to basically help run her father's business, which was more or less like a kind of import-export of tea and silk and random things along the old Silk Road, if you will. And so, because she was just the most intense and strong of the sisters, even her eldest sister kind of didn't hold the candle to her. So she would go to the prison and ask her father for, directions on how to handle things and how to manage their business. And at some point, a few weeks after he was put in prison, some people came by trying to basically take some things and look for documents and whatever. And she basically told them, told the government officials at the age of 9, she was then, that you already took my father. There's nobody left here. You should just go. Like, she was absolutely fierce always. And so, that's the kind of person that she was. And when she was 13, they were exiling a lot of these religious minorities, including Baha'is, who were of Iranian origin. And talking about 5 or 6 generations back. So she left the Soviet Union and went to Iran. And at this point, the Soviet Union was still relatively advanced, and compared to Iran, Iran hadn't seen that boom of oil money and wasn't really a thriving place. And so even the Soviet border guards were like, "Are you sure you want to go to Iran? You can stay. Maybe your grandmother can't." And then but she was like, "Well, we don't have much choice." So they went to Iran, and she didn't speak any Persian. She only spoke Azeri Turkish, which was the family's language and the kind of local language, and Russian. So she comes to Iran, has to learn how to speak the local language. Her eldest sister gets married and leaves basically her to raise her younger sister. So she is, 18 at this point, raising her younger sister, learn this whole new language. She eventually goes to nursing school at the Russian Red Cross, becomes a nurse, and eventually meets my grandfather. And kind of fast forward, she, by the time the revolution comes around, my family were fairly prominent enough Baha'is that it was a dangerous place for them to stay. Because Baha'is were being persecuted in Iran. So she leaves and comes to Canada, where my mother and uncles were. So just having gone through kind of all that stuff, and still being this person who, she loved to dance at parties. She would, love to socialize and just be a very engaging and energetic person was amazing to me.
Mm-hmm.
She sounds amazing.
Yeah. And the way you talk about her, I feel like I can feel your smile. You said even her older sister doesn't hold a candle to her. And one of the interesting things about the podcast, is stories from and about your grandparents teach you about this time and place in history, and about your family, and also about yourself. And I wonder, what have you learned about yourself from your grandmother?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot about my mother, and in turn me, through her, because I kind of saw my mother's resilience and strength. And I always wondered where it came from, because I think that there are some, there's always cultural generalizations you make. And I think Iranians can be, among a lot of positive things, a bit dramatic, a bit over the top, and just kind of, not like how my mother was. My mother is. And my mother is just somebody who's like so no nonsense, has never wanted to burden me or my brother or anybody else. She would just like really be somebody who would do anything for us, and was such a strong person, and never really never made us feel bad if, we wanted to hang out with her friends and not her or something. She just was not somebody about giving us guilt trips. And she herself is like a very successful executive at a pharmaceutical company. So she's somebody that I've always also respected. So seeing where that kind of came from my grandmother, it really was clear to me once I started hearing her story. And to me, I think what that gives me is a sense of resilience, and seeing where it came from, and wanting to kind of persevere through tough times. I think sometimes at work, when dealing with stuff that's middle management is pushing you down or something, I'm like, well, it's not so bad. I didn't have to flee my country twice.
Yes.
And completely start over. I know my grandmother didn't have to deal with a difficult boss, let's say, but I think, I wouldn't trade that for what she went through. It's really challenging. So I think it's really the resilience. And I don't know if you've seen these studies of Holocaust survivors and then their children, and there's certain things that are actually passed down, the trauma of those situations. And I think that it gives people maybe some low-level anxiety, but also this resilience. And I wonder if that's true or not. I can see what my grandmother went through and how it might have passed on to us, even if not just through stories.
And next, you're going to hear from Mel, who is talking about her grandmother's lasting impact on their family.
My grandmother was this matriarch. And it's funny because I feel like she set the tone for so much of the narrative of my life, but I never really thought about it too much until this podcast, because it's just inherently been there. But when you have to think about it, you kind of have to give people credit where credit's due. My relationship with my grandmother, I was her only granddaughter. So in that respect, I always had this torch to carry forward, because my grandmother had 3 girls, only girls, and then just me. And so she didn't live nearby us, so we didn't see her all the time. But that didn't really matter, because when we did see her, it was a big deal. I think I always felt this like bond with her because I was carrying on the sort of female lineage of this matriarchal family. But she also developed Alzheimer's when I was not too old, I would say end of elementary school. So I knew her, like I think I knew the real her for when I was quite young. And then that shifted over time into something different. My grandmother was, her parents immigrated to Canada from Scotland. And she was the youngest of 2 kids, but her older brother passed away quite tragically. The family was in Scotland on holiday, and he rode his bike off a cliff accidentally. And he was 5, 6 years old. So it was this deep, traumatic loss. And she became the sparkle in everyone's life because she was what was left. And that was her role, like always, and almost even still in our like family life. So she was the center of attention growing up. You know, she was playing the piano and singing songs at all the family events, and they doted on her. And then she married my grandfather and moved away, but from her family, but brought them with her and had 3 kids. My grandfather got Parkinson's disease quite young. So once again, she took control and sort of became like the focal point, the nucleus of the family, and went out and got a job, you know, having not had a career really her whole life. And she was this like charge ahead personality. And having 3 girls, my mom and my 2 aunts, they all really took on that personality of, you know, everyone wants to be like Granny. Granny's the star. Granny is like, can do no wrong. Anything if she says it's so, then it's so. And so.
Could she do no wrong?
I mean, it's funny. I don't know. I think she always found a way of getting away with things, kind of with a smile and with a cuteness and a sweetness. It was interesting as she shifted into Alzheimer's and did start to do things wrong, in the sense of that weren't her fault, you know, like losing control of your bladder in situations that are not socially appropriate. And so it was so interesting to see like that shift from this woman who was everything, who was the center of the family. And almost as she moved into her illness, that torch being passed to my mom and then and the next generation. For all 3 sisters, my mom and her 2 sisters, Granny was a giant, and they've all become her in different ways. So they've all embodied different aspects of her personality that they really cherished and thought were valuable to them. So, you know, my mom's middle sister was quite career driven and actually didn't have kids. And she became, you know, really successful professionally, and embodied that there's a proper way of doing things. And my mom embodied the family side of that. You know, she was the daughter that had a big family and became like the center of everything. She just treasures traditions. She sees it as like, that is our responsibility to those who have gone before us to carry forward these traditions that have made us and shaped us into who we are. And then the youngest sister, who actually passed away recently, she had a lot of difficulties in her life. She was born, she had a fever, like scarlet fever, I think, when she was quite young. So she was deaf most of her life. She, oh my gosh, she had SARS. She had chronic arthritis. She had a son who had severe autism. And so Louise embodied overcoming anything that life threw at you. So you really saw the different sides of Granny come out in each daughter. And so that has shaped me a lot, because I've had 3 different role models a generation between me and Granny, and then she's kind of at the top of that. So it's this funny little diamond shape of Granny at the top, then these 3 women who, you know, each chose their own path, and then me at the bottom going, okay, how do I want to take in all of this and have it be part of me?
And here is Jill and Trevor again, brother and sister, who we interviewed together. And what comes through in this story is that despite hardship, their grandmother had such an ultimate kindness that she never let go of.
I'm going to talk about my grandmother, Shirley. She was born in Devon, New Brunswick, just on the north side of Fredericton. She was, back then, of course, everybody had huge families, and 1 or 2 babies or more died at birth, which is incredibly sad. But it just shows, these large families, they had to have them because they needed to have family and workers on the farm and help. And my grandmother, by the time when she was 7, her mom passed away during childbirth. When my great-grandmother died, my great-grandfather worked a lot. So my grandmother at 7 was working for a lady who lived down the street. I only ever heard her name as Mrs. Stewart. And I think she was pretty particular about her house, because my grandmother remembered when she had to go to stay with her when her husband was away, she had to strip at the door. So, and all of her clothes went outside and her shoes stayed outside, and she'd have to have a bath and wear clothes that were only prepared for her there. So I think they knew they were clean, and she would stay with her. And when she was about 12, her father, they were having Sunday dinner, and he got a call that the old DJ Purdy ship had to go through the train bridge here in Fredericton. So he just said, okay, I'm going to be right back. I'm going to borrow your bike. So he took one of his son's bikes and biked down to the train bridge, but he never came back. So that was in May of 42, and they recovered his body. I think it was in July 20th that same year in St. John, New Brunswick. Eventually they settled and thought that he must have had a heart attack or something and just fallen in the water. So she remembered in July that year, the police came to the house and they asked if they would have anything there that these keys could open that they found. Somehow his key ring was still attached to his pants when they found his body. And she remembered them coming and bringing out the keys with big gloves on, and they opened his toolbox, and that's how they knew it was him. So at 12, she went to live with her oldest brother, and he was newly married. And from what her memory serves her, at that, when she told me, they didn't want her. So they didn't want her and her youngest sister, Ruth.
How many siblings was there in total in the family? You said it was a big family.
I believe 9.
9.
Yeah, I believe it was 9. But my grandmother, Shirley, and her sister, Ruth, were the 2 youngest. And so they went to stay with her oldest brother and his new wife. And his new wife wasn't very keen, of course, of having some orphans living with them. And so she wouldn't let them have a bedroom. So they had to sleep. They would wheel out a cot at nighttime, and they would have to sleep in the cot. And it wasn't heated in the hallway, of course, so they'd have to wear their coats and pull up blankets and snuggle in together. And that's where she lived until she was about 14 or 15. And when she got old enough, her sister, one of her sisters, Grace, was married to one of the O'Leary boys from New Maryland, Tommy, and that's who my grandmother went to live with next. And that's where she met our grandfather, Albert. I'm not sure if all of the grandkids had this experience, but with me and Trevor, I know she was very open. We were also the youngest, two of the youngest, so I think that kind of helps. Like, she was pretty laid back, I think, by the time that we came along, and she was very open in talking about her father and how she didn't remember much about her father. She remembered how he used to take off his work shirt when he got home, and, just those little things that you would expect a 12-year-old to remember. I remember her telling me about her mother, and she told me that the day that she died, she baked cookies. And as a 7-year-old, she said that day, in my mind, I was afraid that if I ate those cookies, she'd be gone. So she said none of the kids would eat the cookies. She used to go into their room and smell her pillow and her clothes. And she said, I remember the day that they didn't smell like her anymore. So I think that trauma of that loss was definitely something maybe that made her a little hyper aware of how a kid might feel. And I think maybe that's why she was so fiercely protective and so loving, that it almost... I mean, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't cross her. I wasn't afraid of my own parents, but I was scared of her. I wouldn't say anything out of turn. Like, I remember, like Trevor said, going in there and saying something maybe not so nice. And she would say, you know what? Everything good you do in this world will come back to you, and the bad too. So you better make sure that you do good things for people. And another thing she used to say was, if you burnt your arse, you sit on the blisters. So if you make a choice, you have to live with it.
Yeah.
So she always was giving these sayings and these, it's funny how you remember those. That's what transcends time. Like, she's been gone 4 years now, but those things you remember, and you're always going to remember and pass along, hopefully, to my kids and someday Trevor's kids, and, remind them where they come from.
The thing that comes to mind is the generosity of both her and my grandfather. Anybody, it could be a stranger off the street, walk by their house, and she'd be the first one to offer them anything. Because I know over the years, obviously, we grew up there. That was kind of a second home, like Jill said. And even going in there, like, anything, obviously, we wanted. But, had there been, in the summer, there'd be, like, road work, and she'd offer to take the construction workers out, sandwiches and cans of pop and stuff like that. But every time you'd go in, she'd be telling you, how, even if you were upset about something, even if you were, oh, this person did this to me and it, really made me mad. Well, try to think how they feel. She always made you think that you were obviously no better than anybody else type thing, and how to envision situations so you don't react badly. How to be calm. And just the integrity behind her was just amazing, and me and Jill have talked about this a lot, especially coming from the background that they both did. She had every right to be an angry person, with, being an orphan and everything. But the kindness that woman had, that's what she's known for.
I know my grandmother, even as a grown-up, she would call me and say, where in hell have you been? It's been 2 days. And I'd say, well, man, I called you yesterday. Oh, yeah, that's right. Anyway, how you doing? She always kept a close tab on everybody. And that's, I think, like Trevor said, her kindness is kind of her legacy in a way, because whenever I'm having one of those moments, I think to myself, what would Shirley do? Oh, yeah, she'd tell you to quit your whining. And, when you think of kind of how she went through life and how, the hands that they were dealt that you can't change, you think, yeah, I sure can get to the grocery store and to the gym today. My grandmother raised 4 kids, and her twins were so bad sometimes she had to tie them to the clothesline so that she could get supper ready, So it puts into perspective how we can easily take, I guess, how things are easier now than back then. We can easily take it for granted. Even now, my grandfather will say, like, geez, they say those were the good old days, and kind of joke about it. But, those were hard times when you had 4 kids to raise and you worked 7 days a week. And to come from a family that was really, both parents gone by 12, and that's a hard life.
What stood out to you about Brady's story?
What I liked and found really interesting was the idea of women's unacknowledged resilience. You know, while their husbands, fathers, brothers, you know, the men were at war, they kept things going and took on, you know, the labor and all of this stuff and really held things together, and how that's, you know, not often recognized.
Yeah, and that men during this time were so celebrated and there was this heroism behind them. But I think what Brady's story really shows us is that the women were true heroes as well, both in the public sphere while men were at war and at home.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember any of the stories your grandmother would tell about her life?
Yeah, I certainly do. I'm trying to think of some good ones. I think my grandma Allen, my grandma Fran, I called her because her name was Frances. She grew up on the prairie, Okotoks, Alberta, through the Great Depression, and so you can imagine her stories. There was a lot of hardship out there. They had to do everything. She had to sew her own shoes that she would walk to school in, right? And during the war, she was lucky enough that she managed to get a job with the Alberta wheat pool with a bunch of girls that worked there. Basically, you know, it was important to keep the wheat flowing and the supplies going during the war so that people could eat or whatever. But the thing about her is, I think, and it was a product of her upbringing, she was the toughest person I ever knew. Like, she never complained. She's the only person I ever knew in my life that I never saw complain once about anything. Like, she went blind when she was maybe 79 or so. Like, she had this macular degeneration, and so her vision was getting worse and worse and worse and worse, but she just refused to stop. And my grandpa was not able to really take care of himself on that side of the family very well anymore, and so she did all the cooking and all the cleaning and everything. Anyway, even after she was completely blind, she carried on until he died, cooking every meal, like doing everything in the house. So she just learned how to adapt. And although I could kind of get a sense of her frustration at having to adapt to this change in her life, I think, like, you could see her being like, you know, it's not worth complaining about. It just is what it is, and I have to. So I think I was always fascinated by that level of determination. I also found something a little bit sad about it too, because I think, she just, especially because women in her generation were very underappreciated for their roles. And that is maybe one thing that I will say that's, you know, I think you have to judge people in the time that they lived in and whatever else. But, I don't think that some of those older generations necessarily had some of the same ideas about gender roles and things like that we have now. But I feel like, the kind of sad part about it when I look at my grandmothers, and that is how hard they worked and how maybe that wasn't as appreciated as it probably could have been or should have been. And that I think that they also really understood that at the end of their lives. And I don't know, they had their own piece with it, but it was not really fair. So
I couldn't agree more.
And I think that was something my sister really took away from it as well. And that she helped me to see too.
And there's just so much like when do you catch a break, right? Like for these women who grew up in like such hardship and like all this invisible labor and unrecognized labor for their whole lives. And just think about like how much meaning we take out of our work and our careers. Like we take so much like it's our identity, like for most of us, right? And for so many women, it's such a different time now. So much unrecognized
absolutely.
work and labor.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like there was kind of injustice in the way, you know, I think about just there's stories about, you know, the extended family and everything else too. But, the women worked very, very hard. And then I feel like some of the men, although they went through tremendous hardship when they went away, some of them kind of just, you know, they had all this heroic sort of aura to them when they came back from this war effort, and they got the majority of the praise, and I feel like some of the efforts at home or whatever were maybe not recognized in their time the way they probably should have. And that probably was a difficult thing for that generation to deal with as well.
Yeah, I've totally never thought about that.
My other grandmother, she worked in a munitions factory outside of Toronto for most of the war. And I remember as a kid, I would always wonder, why is grandma missing like half of one of her fingers? It turns out that's exactly what it was from. Is she lost half of her finger, which she never complained about, and she was still perfectly functional and able to do everything. But yeah, she lost that during the war, building the munitions. And so she would always say, we all fought the war. So that's kind of an interesting perspective too, I guess. So I think my grandmother's stories gave me a good sense of what that kind of hardship can be like. It's not just about what people went through on a battlefield. It was about
what was left behind.
Yeah, it was about a lot, and it was about the loss of all the people that went over to fight too, right? And then it's you're expected to carry on in the absence of any kind of certainty about them coming back or what's going to happen or anything else. So I think that's difficult too. So you hear these stories of these sort of tragic lives, and I think they build this resilience in people.
I don't think her and I ever sat down and had a conversation about like life advice. It was more through action that I picked up how to live a good life. Mm-hmm. And that ability of finding a way forward no matter what is something that's just been recurring throughout my life. And it's something that my mom definitely inherited. And so it sort of translated to me via my mom, because we didn't live super close to my grandma. But she's retained that same outlook on life in terms of whatever life's going to throw at you, you can handle. Mm-hmm. You don't even know you can handle it, but you can handle it.
Thank you for listening to Stories from Grandparents. If you have any interest in submitting stories, or if you want to participate on the podcast, please send us an email at storiesfromgrandparentspodcast@gmail.com.